But anyway, you have your own thoughts, Nando.
I do,
so,
I do,
I wanna
and
hear
they're
your
not
postmortem.
they're not too dissimilar to yours. Although I want to kind of laser focus a little bit on Florida, my home state. Okay, well, guys, we've had the election that we've all been waiting for, and I don't know about you guys, but I feel like shit. I mean, I'm obviously relieved that Trump is out, but I just can't feel much in the way of like actual joy. I mean, the results are pretty grim. It's going to be a weak Biden presidency with likely a Republican Senate, although that may change, which means nothing will happen and will likely continue our steady decline into neoliberal hell. But there was one small bit of satisfaction for me because I got to say, I told you so. You see, last week on this very program, I warned the discourse around the election was all wrong and that all signs pointed to Latinos, the fastest growing demographic in America, swinging dramatically to the right. After 4 years in power, Trump is actually improving his standings with minorities. I mean, you may be saying to yourself, Nando, I've been obsessively following the discourse, refreshing Twitter every 2 seconds for 4 years. Trump is a blatant racist and homophobe, and xenophobe, probably homophobe, xenophobe, and he hates people of color. It can't possibly be true that he's actually doing better with blacks and Latinos. Well, it's true. And lo and behold, that did happen. That did happen, catching all of the punditocracy way off guard. You see, in Texas, for example, 41% to 47% of Hispanic voters voted Trump in several heavily Latino bordered counties in the Rio Grande Valley region, a Democratic stronghold typically. In Florida, Trump won 45% of the Latino vote, an 11-point improvement from his 2016 performance. This came, shockingly, despite the fact that Joe Biden did this bit of inspired Latino outreach on the campaign trail.
I just have one thing to say. Hang on here.
All right. There you go. Dance a little bit, Joe. Come on. I'll tell you, my man.
That's right. Uncle Joe busted out Luis Fonsi's monster 2017 hit, Despacito. Sadly, it didn't stop him from bleeding Latino support compared to Hillary Clinton back in 2016. And a lot of the focus has been on Florida, specifically Miami-Dade, where I was born and raised, 305 till I die. The conventional wisdom is that, yeah, that makes sense. They're conservative Cubans who think that anything that is even vaguely left is basically Fidel Castro, who they see as a historic criminal on par with Adolf Hitler himself.
Miami-Dade County key to Trump's Florida victory. It's home to a large number of conservative Latinos, unique in the state and country.
You know, Miami is, some would say, is Hong Kong, right? The rest of Florida is sort of, is kind of connected. Miami's its own thing. It's its own entity.
Good to go down as one of the most progressive presidents in American history.
A flood of political ads tying Biden to socialists struck fear in many Miami-Dade Latinos who'd escaped communist regimes in Cuba and Venezuela.
But is the discourse on the Cuban American vote actually correct? Well, dear viewer, you will be shocked to find out that it is not. Of course, it's true that Cuban Americans are on balance pretty right-wing, but was there a big upsurge for Trump in 2020? Not exactly. According to exit polls, in 2016, Hillary Clinton got 41% of the Cuban vote in Miami-Dade. And in 2020, Joe Biden got exactly 41% of the Cuban vote in Miami-Dade. So it looks like it wasn't an Ola Cubana that caused Biden to underperform in Miami-Dade. And the problem was not limited to the presidential ticket. Incumbents Donna Shalala and Debbie Murcarsel-Powell, both Democrats who represented districts within Miami-Dade County, both lost their House seats to Republicans in races that Democrats did not expect to lose. Debbie Murcarsel-Powell, by the way, you may recall, is the Democratic congresswoman who kneecapped Bernie Sanders after his incredibly mild comments about the Castro regime.
You're calling Senator Sanders' comments absolutely unacceptable. Is Sanders wrong in what he said?
Anderson, as the first South American member of Congress, I represent thousands of Cuban American families that have fled the brutal dictatorship under the Castro regime. And yes, they are completely unacceptable.
And here is Fernanda Mandi, a Democratic strategist, comparing Bernie's comments about Castro to praising Hitler.
Here is partly what Senator Bernie Sanders said Sunday night on 60 Minutes.
We're very opposed to the authoritarian nature of Cuba. But it's unfair to simply say everything is bad.
Words that likely will have political repercussions and come back to haunt Sanders, especially here in South Florida.
I was horrified. I was aghast.
This is coming from a Democratic strategist. Fernand Amandi says such comments jeopardizes Democrats' chances of winning Florida and its 29 electoral votes.
It would be akin to suggesting that there was value in the Third Reich because Hitler built the Autobahn. There is nothing to praise about a totalitarian regime in Cuba.
Nominate Joe Biden, they said. Bernie was too risky, they said, because he could lose Florida. Well, Joe Biden lost Florida. And Debbie Murkazal-Powell, despite her impeccable anti-Castro credentials, lost her seat in Congress. And back in 2018, Democrats lost statewide races they expected to win in Florida for governor and senator. Yet, somehow, despite the fact that Florida and Miami-Dade are clearly trending Republican, and despite the fact that the conventional wisdom says that any left-seeming policies would be toxic in the state because of the dreaded socialist label, Floridian voters overwhelmingly passed a minimum wage hike to $15 an hour, a huge victory for the Fight for 15 movement in the nation's third most populous state.
Right now, Florida's minimum wage is $8.56. With Amendment 2 passing, that means Florida's lowest wages across the state will eventually be brought up to $15 an hour. More than 6.3 million Florida voters voted 61% yes to Amendment 2. Raising the minimum wage, 39% voted no.
Yes, the minimum wage increase passed by a whopping 22 points. And in Miami-Dade, where Hillary Clinton won by 30 points in 2016 and Joe Biden only won by 7, and where voters kicked out 2 incumbent Democrats in favor of Republicans, the mayoral race was won by a woman named Daniela Levine Cava. Daniela Levine Cava will become the first female mayor of Miami-Dade County and the first non-Cuban American mayor in 25 years. She won by running as a pretty bold, good government progressive endorsed by the SEIU and the Dream Defenders, and she defeated conservative Cuban American Steve Bovo. So what the hell is going on here? Well, the problem seems to be pretty clear, that the Democratic Party itself has become toxic in large parts of the country. You see, while Biden technically supported the minimum wage, as Anna mentioned, he didn't really campaign on it. And the mayoral election for Miami-Dade County is nonpartisan, meaning Daniela Levine Cava did not have to put the dreaded D next to her name on the ballot. And this dynamic seems to have replicated itself all across our great nation. Things like marijuana legalization passed everywhere it was on the ballot. For the record, Joe Biden refused to support it. In Arizona, voters passed an initiative to tax incomes over $250,000 to give $1 billion to public schools. Oregonians voted for a tax increase to fund universal pre-K. And yet Democrats themselves did very, very poorly in almost everywhere. Democrats expected to win the presidency, retake the Senate, and increase their majority in the House. Instead, according to the New York Times, of the 27 races the New York Times rated as toss-ups, Republicans have won or are ahead in 25. They have won or are leading in 9 races Democrats were expected to win narrowly. And the fate of the Senate will come down to a couple of special elections in Georgia after they failed to win seats they thought they'd get in Maine, Iowa, North Carolina, and maybe South Carolina, and maybe Montana. What is evident, therefore, is that the leftist belief that the vast majority of Americans support left-wing economic policy holds up. On election night, a series of screenshots of Fox News' exit polls went viral showing 72% of American voters supported, quote, government-run healthcare. The problem is that voters simply do not trust Democratic politicians to deliver on any of these things. And can you blame them? Joe Biden did not run on any real issues, and the vast majority of Democratic candidates ran on pure opposition to Trump without putting forth any bold legislative agenda, despite the fact that, there's this economic crisis that is destroying millions of lives. They did this because they were determined to pitch disaffected conservative voters in the suburbs, and this turned out to be disastrous. But the distrust of Democrats runs deeper than the tactics of this specific campaign cycle. I mean, there are barely any voters alive today who can remember the Democrats delivering anything meaningful to them. Seriously, think of one big, meaningful thing that the Democrats have passed in the last 40 years. Obamacare, it did a little bit, but it also pissed off a lot of people. Gay marriage, that was nice, but it wasn't done through legislation, it was done through the courts. And other than that, the Democrats have just been the party that passed NAFTA and cut welfare. So obviously, the Republicans haven't offered anything either, which is why our politics has become a pure spectator sport over which people are good and which people are considered bad, and what team you're on in the culture war, and that is all that matters. So the strategy of the left has to be one of confrontation with the Democratic Party. Bernie had it right when he called himself an independent. He could credibly distance himself from the horrors of the Democratic Party. And the next crop of Bernie-crats should do the same. I mean, there are some prominent ones coming into Congress, like promising ones coming into Congress like Cori Bush, Jamal Bowman, and Mondaire Jones. Because, you see, the Democrats have become the party of moralizing scolds, the party that says any annoying things like, you people are so stupid for voting against your interests, and don't you believe in science? They've also become the party of radical sloganeering without any substantive transformational agenda. I mean, think of how reparations has become a liberal litmus test that only is enforced in one direction without any real plan to even organize around it. So Democrats do not acknowledge that anything is fundamentally wrong, and they simply chastise voters for being too stupid or too racist or too toxic. The Democratic Party cannot fail, they can only be failed. And those things are not good electorally speaking. The left, whether we like it or not, get lumped in with all of that. And so the left cannot become the party of liberalism, but just more. The pitch has to be simple. A hyper-focus on Medicare for all, labor rights for all, and better wages for all. And that's basically it. Because structurally, the challenges for the left are enormous, and the prospects of the near future seem to be pretty bleak. The Democratic Party has proven more resilient to change from within than a lot of us thought, and that is unlikely to really change. And there may be some opportunities here and there at the local level to rally around candidates like Nithya Raman, who won a city council seat in Los Angeles despite her opponent receiving active support from Nancy Pelosi, Dianne Feinstein, and Hillary Clinton. But the real focus must be, at the end of the day, to revitalize the labor movement somehow. It's old hat at this point, but it's nevertheless true. The only way that anything is going to change is if the working class is organized and powerful. Without that, we are just going to be screaming into the void. And if there's one major criticism of the DSA, is that it's too removed from organized labor. And for that organization to have a long-term future, and for any hope in this country to have a long-term future, it must change immediately.
I love that you mentioned that voters don't trust Democrats to deliver on the economic policies that they every once in a while do campaign on. And I want to just quickly remind everyone that while Obama did run his campaigns, centering those issues, he didn't deliver. And I think that does hurt the party. It hurts the party because if you're going to campaign on one thing and then you refuse to deliver on it once you have the opportunity to, I mean, remember, in his first term, he had both the House and the Senate. He could have easily, utilized that power to pass the kinds of policies that we desperately need today, but we desperately needed back then. But he just proceeded to engage in the same wars that Bush was engaged in. He expanded on those types of policies. He went on to bail out Wall Street. Many Americans were left behind. And that anger, that resentment remains today. And so there are real consequences to that. And I'm glad that you brought that up.
Yeah, I mean, a very sort of troubling example of this was in the UK in the last election with Jeremy Corbyn, in that he collapsed, like his working class support in the north of England collapsed. And even though they agreed with all of his agenda, like the voters, polled, they agreed with all of the economic policies that he espoused, they just assumed that the Labour Party, or really anyone, was ever going to deliver something like that. They just don't believe that anything could be, that government or politics has the ability to improve their lives anymore, because it's been so long since that has happened. So the cynicism is so deep amongst the electorate, and and it's understandable. Like, I'm not trying to like vote shame anyone here. Like, it is understandable. Like, that if some Democrat says, you know, like, I'm here for support middle class families or whatever, and they're like, shut up, you're not, you know, like, because they're right. So it's a little bit of a chicken and egg situation in which, like, because because the government doesn't offer them anything, people like lose interest in government, and because people lose interest in government, then the government doesn't have any democratic pressure to actually offer them anything, and it's a vicious cycle that just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. So something has to happen to break that cycle, and again, it's not going to come from the Democratic Party as it is currently constituted. This is why I'm excited to speak to Seth Ackerman later, because there has to be some other way, you know, and the Democratic Party has become so toxic. It's just become such a toxic vehicle and brand for such a huge amount of the country, especially in the places that matter to actually exercise power, which is like weirdly rural America. You know, because of the way our electoral system is set up, rural America is overcounted. Okay, you can complain about that, but that's just the reality. So then, therefore, any sort of left or any sort of progressive thing has to make a pitch to those people, because that will ensure that there is the kind of majorities in the Congress and Senate that will allow for something like that to pass.